All right, should we go ahead and get started? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to today's important conversation on tech, identity, and justice in a post-Dobbs era, risks, challenges, opportunities. My name is Kirsten Luner. I'm Assistant Professor of English and Coordinator of the Digital Humanities Initiative at SCU. The DHI is one of two co-sponsors of today's event, and our partner co-sponsor is the Center for the Arts and Humanities at SCU. Before we begin, I want to quickly thank co-organizers Michelle Burnham, Amy Randall, Srila Sarkar, and Britt Kane. I'll introduce all of our panelists first before they give their opening remarks. And after opening remarks, Srila will moderate 30 minutes of discussion among panelists on a list of prepared questions. The final 30 minutes will be open for Q&A with the audience, once more moderated by Srila. Our first speaker, Lauren Klein, is Winship Distinguished Research Professor and Associate Professor in the Departments of English and Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory University, where she also directs the Digital Humanities Lab. She is author of An Archive of Taste, Race, and Eating in the Early United States, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2020, and with Catherine D'Ignazio, Data Feminism, published by MIT Press in 2020. With Matthew K. Gold, she edits Debates in the Digital Humanities, a hybrid print digital publication stream that explores debates in the field as they emerge. Our second speaker, Mar Hicks, is an associate professor of history of technology at Illinois Tech. Their research focuses on how gender and sexuality bring hidden technological dynamics to light, and how the experiences of women and LGBTQIA people change the core narratives of the history of computing in unexpected ways. Hicks's award-winning book, Programmed Inequality, looks at how the British lost their early lead in computing by discarding women computer workers, and what this cautionary tale tells us about current issues in high tech. Their new work looks at resistance and queerness in the history of technology. Hicks is also co-editor of the book Your Computer is on Fire, published by MIT Press in 2021, a volume of essays about how we can begin to fix our broken high-tech infrastructures. Our third speaker, Mithali Thakur, is an assistant professor in the Science of Society program at Wesleyan University, with affiliations in anthropology and feminist gender and sexuality studies. She is currently working on a book project, Facing the Child, with MIT Press, an ethnography of artifice, evidence, and the global policing of child pornography. Her second project is a multidisciplinary study of robotic and animate companions in elder care, child care, and other spaces of intimate companionship. Her research and teaching interests include digital policing, content moderation of child sexual abuse material, queer studies of the child, robotics, avatars, and digital companions. Mithali received her Ph.D. from the MIT program in History, Anthropology, and Science, Technology, and Society, and held a postdoctoral fellowship in Sexuality Studies at Northwestern University before coming to Wesleyan. Finally, our moderator, Srila Sarkar, is Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at Santa Clara University. Her research critically studies technology and modernization with a focus on women and work in South Asia. Her work appears in media studies, feminist studies, STS journals, and also in My Computer is on Fire, published by MIT Press. At SCU, she teaches classes on global media studies, social movements, and technology and inequalities in global contexts, including the Silicon Valley. Srila, take it away.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Kirsten. I'm very excited about this event, and we'll just go ahead, get started. So our panelists, our wonderful panelists here will give us brief opening statements about their research. So really looking forward to that, and we'll start with Lauren.
Hi, everyone. I'll just echo Srila and Kirsten and say how happy I am to be here, to be in community and in conversation with everyone else. I am going to share my screen. Okay, and I will get started. So in my work on data feminism, which is co-authored with Catherine D'Ignazio and was published in 2020, one of the major things we tried to think through was this precise intersection of tech, identity, and justice, and the intersection of data and data science with respect to identity and justice in particular. And in the book and in some of our follow-up work, the major questions we ask have to do with how data sets and how data systems, which really just too often, almost always, encode and amplify imbalances of power, can be instead reimagined so that they can challenge and change those power imbalances. And I wanted to sort of frame this by saying that at the time that we began writing the book, it was only beginning to dawn on the general public that data could be this tremendous form of power. And very crucially, that this power was, wielded so unequally. And the titles that you see on the bottom of the screen, which I actually should have included Mars' book as well, because their book was part of this work. But these were the scholars and researchers and journalists who were showing us how data and data science, when it's wielded by a small and homogenous group of corporations and other well-resourced institutions, become the people who have the resources to design and deploy these data systems with their own interests and benefits in mind. And sort of a necessary opposite of this is at the expense of everyone else. And so what Catherine and I tried to do was insert feminism into the conversation. And what we explained in our book is how feminism and intersectional feminism in particular has actually been focused precisely on this issue of unequal power for a very long time. So if you sort of want to put this another way, we're seeing these new terms used to describe phenomena with respect to data and data science and AI. Like right now, everyone's talking about like the brittleness of AI systems, meaning that they mean that these systems are optimized for only certain situations or for certain groups or certain people and not others. The basic idea that systems are optimized for certain groups and not others, like this is not at all news to feminists, or like the constant discovery of like, oh no, the training data, it's so biased. This idea that biases are pretty much baked into not just the scientific record or not just the cultural record, but actually more specifically the scientific record. Again, this has been the subject of feminist STS scholarship, again, for decades. And so what we try to do in the book is use these kinds of teachings along with other ideas from feminist activism and critical thought in order to arrive at these 7 principles for doing more ethical and equitable data science. So you see them right here. They're examine power, challenge power, rethink binaries and hierarchies, elevate emotion and embodiment, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And our goal broadly with these principles was to kind of operationalize feminism for data science. And we can talk a little bit about the sort of pros and cons of that. But, what we wanted to do was provide a clear set of principles for people who are actually working with data, or people who want to work with data, or for people who want to refuse to work with data. And in the book, we have one chapter devoted to each principle. We talk a little bit about the feminist theory that underlies that particular principle. And then we illustrate how it can be applied to data science really through like a lot of examples. But this, I have to say, was 2020. And it was, when you write a book, it actually takes a year to get it from written to published. And we really started writing this in 2018. It came out actually the first week of the pandemic in like mid-March 2020. So there was COVID, there was the Black Lives Matter summer of 2020. There was multiple seasons of wildfires along the West Coast. Here in Atlanta, the protests against Cop City began to happen. This is this police training facility that's proposed to be built on Muskogee land, and in an area which is now predominantly populated by Black and working class people who also oppose this. In case this has now escalated, as the nation now knows. So there are all, this series of events, both national and global and also local. And then in the middle of all of this, the Dobbs decision came down. And I should say, this also impacted Georgia very strongly because we were one of the states that had that one of those trigger laws, meaning that as soon as abortion became illegal, the 6-week ban went into effect. So it's been a time. But this is sort of like a long way of saying that these events and others that I didn't name have really caused me and Catherine, both independently and together, to reevaluate some of these top-level principles that we described in the book. And I want to be clear, it's not that we don't stand by what we wrote at the time, but we've definitely become aware that there are maybe other facets of feminist thinking that have become more relevant. And there are 3 in particular, given the subject of today's panel, that I want to talk about today. And I actually realized I didn't look at the clock when I started talking. And so Shrila, if you want to tell me when I'm getting close to time in the chat or something, that would be amazing, because I don't want to take up other people's time. So these are some of the other feminist principles that I've been thinking about. They have to do with feminist solidarity across national borders, and in particular with sort of destabilizing the dominant position of US feminist movements in relation to other feminist movements taking place across Latin America. The second has to do with the awareness that even as us in the US, with the Dobbs decision, we might be tempted to refocus our attention on childbearing bodies. We really need to redouble our efforts to combat trans exclusionary feminism and remind ourselves that reproductive injustice hurts all of us. And finally, and this is actually a topic that Catherine and I have discussed a lot, and she has a lot more to say about this in her new book on feminicide, consent always. And so I just want to say a little bit more about each one of these 3. The first one having to do with solidarity across borders, and it sort of begins for me when I was meeting up with a visiting scholar from Argentina, and she gave me, we met at a coffee shop in Atlanta, and she pulled out of her bag one of these green bandanas and gave it to me, and she said, "You need this now." And at the time I had actually, maybe I had sort of read about these bandanas, but here I was holding one. And the moment really stayed with me. This was actually before Dobbs. But the point was that she wanted me to know about, but also learn from and be connected to this really decades-long struggle that was ultimately successful in advocating for abortion rights in Argentina. And I think in addition to just these physical mementos, we need models of how to bring together multiple allied interests, reproductive justice and gender justice more broadly. And I think it's important to remember also that this was a struggle that began out of an anti-feminicide movement, right? So it began centered around the issue of violence against women and girls. It grew to encompass access to abortion. And now it includes issues relating to transgender justice. And these activists recognized that their goals were aligned with each other and that they would become more powerful if they allied themselves together. And so the broad lesson of solidarity is one that we need to hear and rehear. But I also think that in the US, we need to hear a related lesson, which has to do with the direction of information exchange between the US and folks in other countries. We tend to think that we are the ones doing the best job. I mean, not necessarily those on this panel, but more broadly in American culture. But we have so much to learn from the struggles and successes of folks all over the world, and we need to do a better job of acknowledging that. I've already hinted at the second point, which has to do with the close relationship between reproductive justice and trans justice. Put simply, we all deserve autonomy over our bodies, and our struggles for autonomy are interrelated. And I think, with this emphasis on protecting women, on childbearing bodies, this is not actually the emphasis we want. And I think we can connect this back to how feminism often gets narrowed in the end, or maybe even in the beginning, to being about women or about gender. But ultimately, we constantly need to remind each other that feminism is about power. And we need to make sure that whatever action or policy that we advocate for in this post-Dobbs world doesn't sort of give with one hand and take away with another. And I think, it's really important to acknowledge that feminism, and white feminists in particular, have a long history of compromising their stated values when their individual power or their group power is on the line. And I think we need to be really, really careful not to repeat that in this case. And then finally, the topic of privacy and consent. I mentioned before, this was a topic that Catherine and I have had some long conversations about. It sort of coursed through data feminism, but we decided at the time not to elevate it to sort of a top level principle. But now that the US has in place these vigilante laws that, your search history, your period tracker can be used as evidence in abortion related charges and allegations, these questions of privacy, which are connected to consent, have returned to the fore. So the consent to engage or not engage, to be private or not be private. And I'll end on a slightly more upbeat note, which is that feminists have been working on these issues for a very long time. And there are ample models of how to give and receive consent in our daily interactions with respect to our bodies and in our technology. And so that's really where I wanted to end, just to sort of start the conversation, let people know what I'm thinking about right now. These ideas are sort of fresh and a little bit raw, but I'm really looking to hear what the other panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Lauren. We'll move next to Mar.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Let me share my slides. Okay, well, thank you so much for starting us off in a really fabulous direction, Lauren. My presentation is probably going to echo a lot of what Lauren has already said, and I'm going to talk about the history of computing, the historical component of computing and tech a bit more. So I'm a historian of technology. I also used to be an IT worker. I was a systems administrator, one of those behind the scenes people who supports the ubiquitous email systems and web systems that we all know and love today and have to use constantly. And so that has definitely influenced my practice of history. That's one of the ways in which my interest in this history came about. And the history that I look at has to do with women in the history of computing and labor of all kinds. As most of you, or many of you probably already know, the history of computing is bound up with the history of the military-industrial complex, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world. This is a picture from the UK. Great Britain had the first functional, operational digital computers that were used for an important end, essentially used for cyber warfare during World War II, code breaking at Bletchley Park. And you can see that this machine is being operated by women. So labor comes into this story in a big way. This is one of the women, not one of the women in that picture, but one of the women who was a Colossus operator today, whom I interviewed. And she had a pretty interesting perspective on what she did. She said, we were sold this idea that World War II was the war to end all wars, and that the things we were doing had to be taken in that context. But it wasn't true. There are, still wars all over the place. We're still in wars all over the place. And I thought that was a very, very important point that she made. So as we go from computers being used for the conduct of war to peacetime uses, business uses, the sorts of things we're more familiar with computers being used for today, even though they are still used in the conduct of war, we have this period in early computing where the labor looks like this, and like this, like this, like this. even like this. There's a little early working from home for you. But as you all know, it flips at some point to having a different and much more masculine image. And so my book, Programmed Inequality, looks at why that happened and what that meant for the power and the future of computing, what that meant for a lot of issues that we're still very concerned about today, not just sexism in computing, but things like surveillance and power. If you're interested in reading more about that, this is the book that I'm referring to. But in my time tonight, I'd like to give you one example that isn't in this book, and that's part of my upcoming and more recent work. And it involves this computer right here, actually, which was a very early system for automating what the British government did in terms of trying to more quickly pay out benefits to its citizens who are paying their taxes into the government in order to have things like old age pensions and access to the national health insurance system, or sorry, the national health system, and so on. And this computer, same picture here, just in black and white. It's funny how much more old-fashioned it looks. Had a remarkable impact on a class of people whom we see similarly impacted today. Trans people were programmed specifically out of this early electronic computer, even though the systems, the slower paper and electromechanical based systems, had not programmed trans people like this gentleman here, Jonathan Ferguson, out of the systems, had not made it seem as though they were bugs who had to be dealt with by the Ministry of Pensions in a different way that caused them to have greater scrutiny, greater oversight of their records. And this example is important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it's the first, as far as I can tell, example of transphobic algorithmic bias in a digital electronic system. It's also important because it shows how surveillance is part of power, and how power and control can be obfuscated through machines and through quote unquote data science. And I'm sure we'll have time to talk about why I'm putting that in quotes in the discussion period. But I'll just point out that, trans people have always been a part of the history of computing, both as practitioners and as users or people who are being impacted by these systems. Women, including trans women and cis women, have always been a part of the history of computing. So the work that I do has a lot to do with making clear how some of the impressions that we have about computing history have not been correct for quite some time, and how we're now having to go back and rethink a lot of our assumptions. And the work that I do, it's also related to what's going on today. These are very current issues, these issues of how much control machines and the data that is put into them should have over our day-to-day life, whether how we describe ourselves is more important than how a machine describes us, and how we get control over that process. There's an awful lot of talk about artificial intelligence right now. But artificial intelligence is a term that is almost meaningless in its vagueness, and also in the way that it describes something that does not yet exist. If we really want to be clear about what's going on with most artificially intelligent systems right now, we might call them things like a system for computational surveillance, for taxonomy and identity assessment. We might call them something that has to do with the technology of machine oversight and behavioral modification. When we have, the latest, greatest kind of AI toys like ChatGPT, we might describe that in a less charitable, but a more accurate way as being a beta that is really not ready to do most of the things it claims, and is currently at the level of, at best, a system that's being tested, and at worst, something that can really not go much further than being somewhat of a party trick. And it's really dangerous when these systems get deployed before they're ready, because, as Lauren mentioned, all sorts of factors that can be used to discriminate and oppress are built in to the data that constructs these systems. And this is just one example. Dr. Joy Buolamwini from MIT has been a leader in showing how there's a lot of racial and racist bias built in to everything from facial recognition software to many other kinds of systems. Here she's showing how a facial recognition system would not even recognize her until she literally put a white mask over her face. Worker scholars like Timnit Gebru, Dr. Gebru worked at Google until she was sort of forced out, fired for doing her job as an AI ethicist, perhaps a little bit too well, and pointing out some of the potential harms of the systems that the company was seeking to monetize. And these structures, these categories that get built into data sets and thereby get built into products, they are often taken as static categories. And that's really dangerous because they're not static categories, they're relational categories. And when they're made static and built into our data and our informational infrastructures, that causes them to become amplified and often causes the harms associated with those categories to become amplified. So what do we do about this? Well, as people used to be very fond of saying during the move fast and break things era, tech is not a democracy. But what does that mean when tech is increasingly governing us, and when data in the public interest is very, very different from most of what tech companies are seeking to collect and operationalize? Well, we're all, I think, familiar, or maybe not all, a lot of us are familiar with this viral tweet from a few years back that implies that, we are in some cases creating the very things that we have been long warned against. We've taken the dystopian version of science fiction in some cases and allowed that to occur rather than striving for the utopian version of what sci-fi showed us. But the difficulty here is that utopias and dystopias are always just two sides of the same coin. There is a much thinner line between them than we may imagine. And the reason there's a very thin line between them is because both have an awful lot to do with exerting power and control over societies. So I co-authored and co-edited this book, Your Computer is on Fire, came out in 2021, specifically for people, for tech workers, for students who are in STEM and maybe are interested in figuring out what kinds of things they can do in their day-to-day to fight against tech overreach and try to make sure we don't get to the torment nexus version of our future. And I'll just say by way of wrap up that I think three short key lessons from the history of computing and the history of gender in computing is that a lot of times systems present problems for us that are called bugs, but they're not really bugs. They're essential features of the way the system operates. So they can't really be fixed unless you structurally change the system under consideration. Another thing is that for a long time, we've been told that technological fixes are the best way to fix something. And that simply isn't true when we're talking about social problems. Technological fixes alone for social problems, they usually don't work, as I think we've seen all around us for the past several years. And the third thing I'll mention is that, and this might get under the skin of some STEM folks, but users are just as important as engineers. The thing is, engineers seem more important because they have more power. And this mirrors the existing power structures at play in society. And these are three things that I think that we can all agree are important in the context of how, for instance, reproductive technology is going to affect people in the United States in a post-Dobbs landscape, how the everything from the personal computers and cell phones and apps that we use to make sense of the data of our lives is going to potentially have a role to play in that. And I look forward to hearing Mitali's presentation and speaking with you all more about these issues in the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mar. We're going to turn to Mitali next.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon for those on the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast. Thanks so much to Srila and to Santa Clara for putting this together, and to my fantastic co-panelists. Looking forward to the discussion. I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides. Great. So in my brief remarks today, I'm going to share a bit about my ongoing research into the digital policing of child pornography, or as it's known in the United States, child sexual abuse images, abbreviated as CSAM. And I'm also going to talk about two relevant Supreme Court cases that are going on right now about tech platforms. And then I'll zoom out with some thoughts on policing, surveillance, and privacy in general that we can continue in the discussion. Some of these bigger questions include, what does privacy mean and for whom? Who gets to have privacy? Who's never had privacy? What is driving our or societal desires for privacy? Is more privacy the antidote to surveillance? And what are we willing to give up in the name of online protection? So a few weeks ago, and it's going on right now, the Supreme Court has begun hearing arguments in two court cases that could fundamentally reshape the internet, Gonzalez v. Google and Twitter v. Tamne. And these are both cases that deal with terrorism, ostensibly. So it might not seem necessarily relevant immediately to thinking about abortion rights, but I want us to sort of think about the implications of what these cases are asking us to do. So in Gonzalez v. Google, the family of Noemi Gonzalez, an American victim of an ISIS terrorist shooting in Paris, her family argued that Google's algorithms should be held responsible for promoting ISIS videos via YouTube, which Google owns. In Twitter v. Tamne, similarly, the prosecution argues that Twitter contributed to a 2017 ISIS attack in Istanbul by hosting propaganda content on its platform. Both cases pose questions over the extent of tech corporations' responsibility for what content they host by users on their platforms. Google is arguing that they are protected by a provision of the Communications Decency Act known as Section 230, an immunity clause that protects internet service providers from liability over what users post online. Critics of Section 230 argue that tech companies wield the law as a loophole to protect themselves against a wide array of allegations, such as, in this case, facilitating terrorist propaganda, but also including issues like drug sales, sexual harassment, illegal arms sales, or human trafficking, which is the issue that my research deals with. This is behavior that they would have likely been held liable for in an offline context. On the flip side, many privacy advocates, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, have defended Section 230 as a critical tool for protecting free speech on the internet. We can't essentially hold companies responsible for what users on their platforms are posting. We should be protecting that as free speech. My own research has been focused on the ways that companies are or are not moderating violent content, specifically child pornography or CSAM. In the week before the Google and Twitter hearing, so just in early February, the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing called Protecting Our Children Online and introduced 4 bipartisan bills that would increase platforms' liability for hosting CSAM or abusive content and impose a duty of care on online platforms to proactively prevent CSAM and end exploitation. One of these bills, the Earn It Act would specifically amend Section 230, the section that I just described, would specifically amend Section 230 to increase companies' liability for CSAM and furthermore allow for government monitoring of end-to-end encrypted messaging to proactively detect CSAM. Now, under existing laws, companies are currently responsible for reporting CSAM whenever it is reported or flagged by a human or an algorithm. So for instance, companies that knowingly know that child pornography has been posted on their platform must report it to law enforcement. Under a set of bills called FOSTA-SESTA in 2018, Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, companies are not protected by Section 230 for any content promoting prostitution, which is a way of talking about sex trafficking and adult sex trafficking. I'm also happy to talk more about the content moderation practice itself in the Q&A, like how these algorithms and humans work together or don't work together in finding this content. The Earn It Act, which is this proposed bill that I'm talking about, would expand the terms of liability to include CSAM that is hosted knowingly or unknowingly, and most importantly, enable detection or moderation of CSAM even in end-to-end encrypted messages, which has led to posters and articles like this one from the Electronic Frontier Foundation suggesting that the Earn It Act would violate the Constitution. All of these bills to protect children may sound well and good. Technology companies wield enormous power and influence, as my co-panelists have also been describing. And over the past few years, we've seen mounting evidence of the biased manner in which algorithmic recommendation and filtering tools work. We have a growing understanding that our technology and algorithms are not neutral and objective. Calls for companies to take responsibility seem ever more urgent. At the same time, I want to call attention to the fact that when people ask for companies to take responsibility, often this actually looks like increasing governmental tools for monitoring and surveillance. I will note that when a bill like the Earn It Act suggests that monitoring people's end-to-end encrypted messages for CSAM, child pornography images, this actually also means monitoring your messaging apps like WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook or Meta, which are normally encrypted or private messages between users. The Supreme Court cases and proposed bills that I've described all suggest that tech companies have been essentially aiding and abetting terrorists and child abusers. Those are the allegations under these Supreme Court cases. Issues like terrorism or child trafficking are often held up as the limit case to justify increased surveillance and intrude into private communication. But in a post-Dobbs decision era, I think these questions of the limits of expansion, the limits or expansion of surveillance and what sort of speech and messages are protected have become increasingly important. As many pro-choice activists have noted, one of the threats in a post-Dobbs world is the possibility of messages and apps related to abortion, fertility, or other personal reproductive decisions being leaked, surveilled, or moderated. In this view, the right to individual privacy is connected to personal autonomy and choice. And I'll note that currently Section 230 does protect platforms for any content posted related to sending information around abortion, right, or giving out information related to abortion. But this is becoming an increasingly sticky and thorny issue. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. The threats of child abuse content or terrorist propaganda online seem to justify a knee-jerk call for technology companies to bear the brunt of responsibility for moderating posted content. But I would argue that these calls reflect a wider moral panic. As Roger Lancaster has described, moral panics like sex panics give rise to bloated imaginings of risk and inflated conceptions of harm. Ironically, when we make calls for tech companies to take more responsibility to moderate what gets circulated on their platforms, we are also potentially augmenting their power. So what I mean by this is that most of the time when we're talking about the moderation of content, for example, in CSAM, this is currently left up to companies themselves to figure out. So Google, Meta, and other platforms have been designing their own in-house tools, algorithmic search tools for detecting images or videos of violence. I shared this image, I skipped past it earlier. This is the very controversial CSAM detection process that Apple tried to release in 2021, and they've then quietly sort of taken it back. They rolled it back, where essentially they were proposing that they would search people's devices, iPhone users' devices, for CSAM, and it was seen as a gross violation of privacy, which is why it's been rolled back. I can return to this slide in the Q&A. The tension between privacy And surveillance, tech immunity versus responsibility is a thorny issue for feminists. But there's also a profound opportunity here, I'm arguing, for reconfiguring our values around privacy in the first place. And I just found this article while preparing for today. It's an article from this past summer that Americans will finally now care about data privacy with the end of Roe. I think that my co-panelists and those of you in the audience would argue that we've long been thinking about privacy and bodily autonomy since before this decision. But anyways, rather than setting up the protection of children, which is justifying a lot of the surveillance processes I'm talking about, and the protection of rights to privacy, such as protecting women's rights to choice, as somehow fundamentally opposed, we ought to consider how our current framework towards privacy locates freedom within the individual, right? Locates autonomy within the individual. So privacy is set up as contractual, and therefore efforts to erode privacy hinge on someone being deserving of privacy. Otherwise, they're vulnerable to surveillance. We've tended to think of privacy as a security issue, which has also resulted in the proposal of individualized security solutions, such as new messaging apps that are better or more encrypted, are going to be better preserving your privacy. Instead, if we upheld privacy as a human right not located within individuals, but rather as a way to hold each other accountable and tech companies accountable, we have the potential to build a more just and ethical feminist future for the internet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was just such an amazing set of opening statements. And I'm going to jump into the moderated Q&A with me. And we probably have about 15, 20 minutes, and then we're going to move to audience questions. So in each of your work, you all address this powerful myth of technology as neutral. And I think, you've each talked about it in your opening statements, but I'm wondering if you can tease out more for our audience, many of who are undergrads, some of whom are in STEM disciplines, especially given our location in the very heart of Silicon Valley, what this sort of powerful narrative of meritocracy or neutrality looks like in relationship to technology, and how powerful is this narrative, and why can this be a deeply flawed and problematic promise? And please feel free to jump in.
Well, I'll just briefly say, from a historical perspective, it's always so interesting to see these arguments about technology being able to be endlessly plastic or sort of used for anything, because the whole point of a technology is that it does something specific, that it makes it easier to do a specific task. And when a technology isn't very clear about what specific task it's making easier or allowing somebody to do, that's a little dangerous, because that means that either there's a good reason to hide that information or nobody knows. Technologies are always tools for concentrating power. That is not just a side effect. That is what they're for. And that's very important when you're trying to solve problems. Public health technologies, for instance, like sanitary sewers, or any number of the things that just we take for granted as the background infrastructure that allows us to live. Those are technologies that were designed to enhance the power of the state in ways that would protect the people who were living within it. And so I just think it's really interesting when we have these conversations to think about who benefits from obfuscating what technologies actually do and whose power they enhance. And I'll hand it over to Lauren and Natal.
Sure. Maybe I'll just pick that up, because that was an amazing setup. And I actually want to connect this back, sort of what you were saying about whose power these technologies enhance. And I want to connect this back to where Mithali ended up with that article saying like now Americans will finally care about data privacy. Because I think, one of the things that happens a lot is we confuse neutrality for what's really just the default. And I think that, that what that headline really made clear to me in the context of Mithali's remarks is that, the reason why Americans, implied like white American cis women, now care about data privacy is that until now, the baseline default privacy settings worked for them, right? And it's really only when you get exposed the settings that don't work for you or for your group or the majority of users, that you start to realize that it wasn't that the technology was designed as neutral, but it was just designed from the sort of the dominant perspective that didn't really have anyone, honestly, anyone who was listened to enough saying, this doesn't work for me. So maybe I'll just stop there because I'm sure that this is something that probably all of us could go on for hours.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just add in like on a more technical level, like some of the technologies that I'm talking about for detecting CSAM, that's image recognition software and facial recognition software. So, I think as both of the other panelists have described, there's a lot of emerging research on the bias, the racial bias, the gendered bias of image recognition. What that actually means in the context of what I'm talking about is that certain children's images literally don't get recognized. So ostensibly, this surveillance software is meant to protect children, all children, but some children are never even included in the scope of some of this software. So, and I do ethnographic fieldwork. I interview a lot of people who work at tech companies on what they're doing. These are not bad people. They have good intentions to protect children, for instance. But the thing is, we start to then fall into the trap of thinking that we just need to better the technology rather than questioning more broadly the surveillance culture that's enabling all these practices in the first place. I think Mara put it this way, right? That we start to seek tech fixes for social problems. That's the problem. And that's sort of what I hope we can get to in bringing a feminist approach to some of these technologies.
Okay, thank you very much. So my second question, related to this discussion, each of you really highlight embodiment in your work in different ways. Lauren, you describe it, you discuss embodiment and emotion related to data visualization in your work. Mithali, you discuss pleasure in the process of deploying policing technologies. And I know there's a certain way that you frame pleasure. Mar, your work centers on the lived experiences of women and transgendered citizens in the history of computing. I'm wondering if you can each speak to tease out this role of embodiment or emotion and affect in your work and how these concepts relate to technologies and that have, these questions have become more urgent in a way in this post Dobbs era. I know that's like a big question and involves discussing and teasing out various concepts, but yeah, would love to hear more about it.
Maybe I can go first with this one and just say some sort of broad remarks. But I think, this question about embodiment and emotion and affect, this is fundamentally a question of ways of knowing, right? Like how we know what we know, how we know what's true, and how we make the choices that we make. And I think one of the things that we really need to resist, like both in the world, but especially in technologies, is a sort of binaristic thinking that says that you can only know something in one way, right? Or that one way of knowing is somehow intrinsically better than another way of knowing. And the reason why I said that we need to be very careful about this in technology is not only that computational technology is fundamentally premised on binary decisions, but it is also sort of biased towards solutions that seem more tractable, more easy to sort of operationalize or model. And this leads towards decision-making processes that are neat, that are tidy, and that seem to have sort of like a clear path forward. And what this leaves out is all the other ways of experiencing the world and bringing knowledge together and sort of generating the richness that is lived experience. So I actually realized that was kind of like big and vague, but maybe one of the other panelists can add, sort of layer in some specificity here.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about embodiment in my work is as a way of starting to think about algorithmic bias. So I mentioned earlier in my talk, like when I'm talking about content moderation, a lot of companies have their own in-house algorithmic systems for flagging content as violent or as abusive. Some of you may have experienced this, right? Images that kind of get grayed out as potentially containing sensitive content. Like that is a sort of algorithmic process. But then the next step of filtering that a lot of these companies do is to have human moderators looking at these images also. And so it's important to think about this as not a fully automated process, but one that is the combinations of humans and algorithms working together. The thing is, when we start to then bring humans in, we're talking about bias, we're talking about people using their own intuition, right? And ways of sort of thinking of an image as potentially being suspicious or potentially needing to be investigated further. So I think about the embodied labor of content moderation, like what decisions people working at companies are making to actually look at that content. And then just zooming out, I'm also thinking about the larger moral panics that are attached to calls for content moderation in general. So I mentioned the Gonzalez v. Google case, this idea that Google is responsible for ISIS content. I think people feel viscerally an anger at tech companies, and this is also an embodied process. What I'm cautioning against is that when we shift that kind of visceral attachment to wanting to fight terrorism or trafficking, when we shift it into advocating for more surveillance, then we have a problem. And so I want us to just be mindful of how we're thinking about embodiment in sort of two different ways.
So I'll just mention, for a quick historical anecdote relating to like the first couple of slides I showed you from the Colossus operators during World War II, when they were using these computers to break codes. It's a very abstract sort of work. And they broke, say, a particularly important code. They sometimes decorated the machine room with flowers. The reason they did that is because they knew what that code breaking meant was that maybe some of their certainly countrymen, possibly brothers, fathers, were now not going to be killed by opposing forces or less likely to be killed that week. Technology is only useful in as much as it's applied. That's one of the things that distinguishes technology from science and scientific endeavor. Technology must be applied. And so the use of a technology is absolutely critical to what a technology actually is. That's why it's so dangerous, I feel, to create technologies or data sets even without clear intention, because they will find a use. And in a capitalist society that is concerned with short-term profit and gain for the people who already have the most capital, you can see the direction in which those uses will tend to go if there isn't already a clear intention.
Thank you for that. I'll just ask one more question before we can move on to audience questions. And audience members, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. So my question for you is, could you speak, and I think you've all done this in various ways, but could you speak a little more about state and corporate power over marginalized communities and bodies, historically and or in the contemporary context related to your research? And how are we to think of these issues in the current moment? For example, in the wake of the Dobbs decision, many of us have become fearful about whether our online activity is being tracked, how that information is being used. Do you think these fears are warranted? And what advice would you give folks with those concerns?
Well, I think it's a big question. So I'm just going to start in a small aspect. I mean, one of the things, the reason I'm bringing up a Supreme Court case around free speech and about terrorism and trying to connect it to Dobbs is that we need to be paying attention to all of these interlinked issues. where tech companies are currently the sort of battlegrounds for how we think about these issues around power. But these are longstanding questions around surveillance and privacy. So the Section 230 that I've been describing, which is ostensibly about free speech, protecting free speech, also would protect companies that are hosting any content related to sharing information about pro-choice or abortion access initiatives or steps for seeking an abortion, like whatever, any content related to abortion, like all of that would be protected as free speech if we're upholding Section 230. But there is a real threat to that right now with a Supreme Court case, with a very conservative Supreme Court, looking at trying to fight against corporate power, but that also then risks bringing up this question of what speech and what sort of content will be protected. So can people actually get information online related to abortions, but then we're trying to now fight against big tech and all of its surveillance regime. So it's a really tricky issue, and I want us to sort of be mindful of the sort of larger legal landscape that's not just about women's bodily autonomy, but actually brings up these much larger questions around surveillance, privacy, and free speech, that they're all sort of interconnected.
Lauren or Mar, do any of you want to jump in?
Jumping off of Mitali's great comments, I'll say that, from my perspective as a historian, the point Mitali was making about like having a nuanced understanding of what's going on is really important, because, one of the things that I look at with the trans folks in the UK who were trying to get their state benefits sorted out is that there was a clear benefit to disclosing and outing themselves to the government in order to get them, essentially they had paid into the system and they were not going to get the right benefits out unless they outed themselves in some cases. And that was also immensely dangerous. So it wasn't something that certainly all, or probably even most trans people who may have been out in other aspects of their lives chose to do. And we see a similar thing, today as some countries and states are allowing people to change their documentation, to have, for instance, like an X or a non-binary gender marker. There are a lot of people who, in the genderqueer community who are very happy to see that. And there are a lot of others who are very, very concerned about what some of the ramifications of using that feature might be. And some of these things, the happiness of seeing the potential to do this and concern about it, it's the same people who have these feelings. And it's very often difficult to understand all the ways in which our data can be weaponized against us, or the technological systems that we benefit from using may come back to hurt us or haunt us. And so it's this constantly shifting landscape and problem for users to navigate in a way that often is, very unfair, because users don't have the power in these relationships for the most part.
Yeah, maybe I'll just echo and amplify what's been said already. I mean, Mar's example is a really compelling and real example of how data is really this double-edged sword, right? In the full extent of that term, it can be a weapon, right? And on the one hand, it can be a real tool of sort of representation and empowerment, but on the other hand, that exact same data set, or you becoming a data point in a data set, can be used against you in some unforeseen or unanticipated way. And this happens at the individual level, at the group level. It happens at the level of law in the ways that Mithali has just described with the questions around free speech. And I think, we know this, and we also know, as Mara said earlier, we know which direction power always goes, right? And so I think when we're making these decisions about whether to be counted, whether to disclose information about ourselves or about the groups that we're a part of, whether to support increased restrictions on what can or cannot be said, we always need to think about the inverse of that. What might happen if the same information, if the same policy was wielded by a bad actor? I mean, the example that we talk about in data feminism, well, we talk about a lot of examples like this, but one of the sort of more broader ones has to do with women's reproductive health care. And we sort of contrast the example of really, really poor mortality rates for people having children, for all people having children in the United States, but in particular for Black people who are having children. The mortality rates are exceptionally high, and yet we don't have data, or up until very recently, we had really poor data on this. So even if we wanted to figure out where the bad decisions were being made or where the bad care was coming from, aside from structural racism, like in the actual hospital setting, and we didn't even have the data to begin to tackle that issue. On the flip side, we have companies like Target, who very famously figured out literally 10 years ago how to tell through purchasing history which of their customers was having a baby, months before even their family ever knew. This has been debunked a little bit, but I feel like the contrast is still valid, right? Because data backed by corporate power and profit-minded interests will always dominate over the actual health and well-being of people and minoritized people in particular. And so when we're deciding, I guess, at both an individual and a collective level, whether or not we want to participate in data collection, data tracking, some sort of data system development, we need to know that if the sort of the limits or the bounds of our decision or our systems are not very carefully put in place, the likely end is one in which minoritized people and minoritized groups become at the receiving end of the sort of this unequal state power, usually with violence, incarceration, and very poor results at the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to move to, we have some great audience questions. So the first question from an audience member is, how can people who are not involved in STEM or in the technological field help combat the problem of bias in tech? Where should we go for answers or research?
Well, I can just say briefly, one of the things that's really inspired me is seeing how many community-led and community-based activism groups have been so successful in, for instance, rejecting surveillance technologies. All around the country now, there are fights going on about how surveilled communities are going to be. And there are many grassroots groups who have, or are in the process of, getting those communities on a political level to successfully reject greater surveillance of their communities. And I think that's really important because that kind of shows how even if you quote unquote aren't in STEM, you can have a very big role, and you kind of are in STEM in a way because you're going to be subject to it. And that refusal of a technology is a valid option. It's oftentimes a very important tool in the toolkit of people who are trying to, in fact, improve technologies.
Well, I think there's a question that is related to this question, which is, how are activists, particularly intersectional feminists, using digital tools themselves to fight back against digital surveillance and threats to privacy?
I can just give a couple examples. I mean, Hack Blossom, for instance, is a feminist cybersecurity activist project trying to educate the general public, feminists, not necessarily just techie people, on how to think about personal privacy and digital privacy. I mentioned this a little bit in my talk. I fully support efforts like this, but I do think that they tend to put the onus on the individual to protect their own privacy. And I want us to think more collectively about how everyone's privacy could be protected. There are a couple bills that have been proposed. My Body, My Data by Representative Sarah Jacobs, for instance, which are trying to connect reproductive health apps like fertility trackers and period tracking apps under larger legislative protections for health information more broadly. So there are efforts right now to try to connect the personal privacy with this sort of larger political health questions. So that, and that's more like formal government, less activist. But yeah, just a couple of examples: Hack Blossom, and then this larger legislative effort.
Yeah, one specific example and then a sort of general example. I did have one slide up on my screen for the Consentful Tech project, and that's a project that I really love that came out of the Allied Media Conference, and it's a really comprehensive website that articulates very clear principles of consent for engaging in with technology, but I think that, that come from deep feminist thinking and experience and are sort of much more broadly applied. The Feminist Data Manifesto also gives a very clear sort of set of principles and justifications for refusing to engage in data practices, but very crucially sort of like in a feminist way. So refusing so as to sort of hold space for what might sort of fill in the negative space left by the technology that was unwanted. But I will say that again, it's not like, it's not a binary, right? It's not like an app or a website is either feminist or not, or that you can't take feminist thinking into sort of more mainstream technical projects. And I think this is really, really important, especially to that question about like, what do you do if you're in STEM or it's in a STEM company and like it's your job and it's your first job and you have student loans, you can't get fired, right? Like it's okay. Like you don't need to, like stage a walkout necessarily, at least not first in your first week, and like go join a better company, but you can bring this kind of thinking to the design table, right? So like right now, I'm involved with this collaboration with a bunch of data visualization researchers, and they're just trying to sort of improve technology about tools for ranking people. So it's like, there are a lot of situations where you need to come up with an ordered list of people according to some criteria. But their question is like, well, what would this look like if instead of a sort of unitary view, you allowed the people who were themselves like that, where this is in the context of like author order in a paper, like how do you decide the list of authors, right? There needs to be a decision. They got to go in a line. Words go left to right, so do names, we need to end up somewhere. But what would a technology look like if each person could say, this is how I see it. This is how I see how the authors should be sorted. And then what in turn would a technology look like that sort of assimilates multiple perspectives in the way that feminist theory has long said sort of is the way in which we can best understand the world. And so there's all these different levels that I think if you're attentive to these kind of concerns, you can see them play out in very obvious, clear, holistic ways, or you can sort of bring them to the task at hand and try to make it a little bit better.
Well, I think related to that, and I think maybe Lauren's already spoken a little bit to this question, but so if we were to move away from binary and towards intersectional thinking, what ends up replacing surveillance culture? Where do you see us going next?
Well, I'll just note, you want to go ahead, Lauren? I'll just note that, I think that if we are trying to take an intersectional framework and apply it to surveillance and policing, that has to start really with, the reduction of policing and with prison abolition, like those are great places to start. And they're hard problems, not necessarily because we don't know how to solve them, but because there isn't the political will right now to solve them. In fact, there's political will to do the opposite. So I think that, we've been talking a lot about things that are like consumer products and people being forced or kind of coerced to use consumer products. But if we really, listen to what Black feminists have been saying, we need to start with, the very real coercion of the state against minoritized and marginalized communities in the form of, all of the surveillance that is going into policing and incarceration. I'll just mention.
Yeah, I mean, just going off of that, like to think about how deeply surveillance culture is embedded into all of our practices, not just like policing with a capital P, but like all of the ways that we operate as a society under racial capitalism. So what is the opposite of surveillance? I think the thing that I'm trying to push us towards is that it's not just privacy is not the opposite of surveillance. Like full privacy also, because the way that we've been thinking about privacy is as a technological fix where individual people protect their own apps and just think about themselves. So I don't have a clear answer for you, but I think it is something like a collective vision of accountability rather than privacy. That's not a very satisfying answer, but that's kind of the point, right? It's hard work to really undo, as Mara is saying, like centuries of oppression and incarceration and policing, which then seep into these sort of technological forms today. Wendy Chun, who's a media scholar, has a sort of way of thinking about the opposite of privacy as maybe we should instead be thinking about exposure and leaking and like everyone's right to be exposed and everyone's right to just sort of be out there and be themselves. And so maybe that's another way to think about it more poetically.
Right, I'm going to go to the next question. So Ma noted that users are as important as engineers, but the latter have more power. Do you see any examples of better empowering users and their consent, both in general and in relation to the issues of bodily autonomy under discussion here?
I actually feel like if you're willing, that is a question that is ready-made for Mitali to answer, because so much of your work really does address that.
I'm not ready with an answer, but let me think for a minute.
So while you're thinking, I'll just sort of let you know what first came to mind, which initially my response was like, don't see examples of this, at least not at a broad scale. However, I think we've seen how there's sort of different degrees of attention to users and to user concerns play out on these major platforms. And my example was going to be the dismantling of Twitter, right? Which is that we never would have thought 6 months ago that somehow, I mean, maybe we sort of knew that Twitter maintained their ethical research division longer than Google did or longer than Facebook did and didn't fire their Black and women employees for speaking the truth. But I'm not sure that we would have said categorically like Twitter is a better platform than Facebook or Google. However, as we saw the breakdown of certain certain mechanisms under the hood, shall we say, by the firing of key team members, we saw how the sort of incremental stripping away of what were evidently certain safeguards against certain types of like hate speech, reporting abusive language, banning and blocking users, like each of those were sort of owned by individual teams. And when those teams got fired, they no longer worked on the platform anymore. And so we did get shown the sort of, I think like a new level of granularity about the range of types of services that should be built into these big systems, so that they can even like partially baseline function for some people.
Yeah, I just want to add to that then. I mean, I think when we see breakdown, we start to see the ways that all these platforms worked. And so to the point, to the question about engineers, I think there's been a lot of activist work within tech companies in the last few years to recognize other workers who also make tech companies function. I think Mara mentioned the Tech Workers Coalition in their presentation. mean, just thinking about like, it's not just engineers, and actually engineers are this very small worker component of tech companies. There's a lot of other people, a lot of humans that go into making our platforms function. So when we start to see that recognition of that labor, we're starting to see some sort of change within the companies. And then, just thinking about user feedback does have an impact on how companies run, and people leave platforms in large groups because they're not happy as users. So there's power on a sort of really smaller level also. Yeah.
And I guess I would just briefly say, in a functional democracy, it's possible to get legislation that works in users' interests. The GDPR has been doing not everything right, but a lot right. But we're in a particular moment in the United States where there may not be the same political tools available to us. And that is something that obviously we have to struggle to build.
Thank you all. This has just been such a rich discussion. I'm just going to ask one last question, which is that the reversal of Roe v. Wade has been a tremendous emotional event for a lot of people, and this has the potential to pave way for more legislation that threatens human rights, especially those of marginalized individuals. What in the midst of this gives you hope? Where maybe turn to for hope? And also, if there's any resource sharing that you would like to share with the audience. So for example, any books, websites, groups, action campaigns, you've mentioned this, you've mentioned some examples already, that people can get more content or context and take action.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I think there's been a recognition that a lot of our oppression is interconnected. Yes, under the reversal of Roe, a number of white women finally realized threats to privacy. That's maybe a negative perspective. On the other hand, I think there's been a lot of opportunities and collaborations opened up between different minoritized or marginalized populations, thinking about privacy and surveillance more broadly. So this recognition of interlocking oppressions has been really profound. There's just so much mobilization right now on a global scale too, as Lauren mentioned in her talk.
Yeah, I would say that, some of the things that really give me hope are to see, as Mitali alluded to, worker organizing in tech. There is the Tech Workers Coalition that is trying to do more sort of top to bottom organizing in tech. That's certainly in labor action is an important strategy. I look at activists like I mentioned, I think I may have mentioned Tawana Petty, who I believe is working with the Algorithmic Justice League right now. Work like that really gives me hope. Dr. Timney Gebru and DARE, the DARE Institute, which is trying to work from the outside to impact AI technologies in a productive fashion. And just as a plug for the work that I'm trying to do to help in this respect, that co-authored, co-edited volume, Your Computer is on Fire, in which Tali has a terrific chapter in case, you are looking for something to teach with, or you're looking for just even something to read as like a STEM undergrad, wondering, how do I not end up being a cog in the wheel as I go into this workforce? That's one place to start, maybe.
Yeah, I'll just echo what everyone else has said. I mean, organizing, if you look historically at what has worked, especially groups taking on corporate interests, it really is structured organizing that gets corporations to change. You sort of need to come up with a demand that costs more than they're willing to pay. And so that, that's evidence-based. I mean, the other thing is looking, as Mitali said, coalitions work, both nationally, transnationally, and we can look again historically and around the world to see evidence of how people with allied interests coming together to make change. These things work too. In terms of, other specific examples, I'm thinking, the conclusion of data feminism begins by quoting Marr and their work on organizing. So if you want a nice connection between Your Computer is on Fire and some of the work that I've done, data feminism can be that bridge. It has a lot of examples. Most are small. I will say that, like, most are small tech, but some are big tech. And those are all sort of, we picked those examples because they seem to us examples that were achievable, by communities, in communities, small groups of people, not necessarily with the, most number of technical credentials, but just, people who wanted to make a difference. And yeah, all hell MIT Press, says Michelle in the chat. Yeah, I mean, I think, there are examples that we can look to. There are examples that have worked. And the important thing, I think, is not to give up, is to keep on going.
And I forgot to mention, Srila also has an amazing chapter in Your Computer is on Fire. Forgot to say that, sorry.
Thank you, everyone. This has just been such an amazing, rich conversation and so timely. So thank you. I know each of you is, a very busy person, as an academic and as an activist. So thank you so much for coming here, and thank you for participating. And thanks to a wonderful audience for being here and asking questions. And also the video will be up on the Center for Arts and Humanities site soon. So yes, I think I would just like to close by just conveying my deep appreciation to everyone for being here today.
Thank you so much for making this space.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to wait for Britt to maybe close this.